Hey, gang. I thought that we'd do kind of a fun, nonchalant one here. It's the last day of IAE, but I figured this one will probably survive the show a little bit. Just kind of a fun one, kind of something that's been rooting around the back of my brain. Should be pretty short. This is going to be, you probably recognize this. I just got this called up in Photoshop. So this is the sort of power triangle that CIG uses. And it is, you've got weapons, shields, and thrusters down here loosely, but I am going to define it slightly differently as weapon survivability and mobility. Now, why I'm doing this is I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about each of the different manufacturers and kind of where they fall into this triangle. But before I get into that, I kind of wanted to define what I mean here. So by weapons, this could mean broadly like actual guns on the ship, but it could also be EMPs and bombs. Survivability could be shields, but it could also be armor in this case. So when you're using your power triangle, it's shields. But in this case, it's actually a combination of, think of another little triangle where you've got shields, armor, and then the sort of structural integrity of your components on your ship. Mobility is pretty much how fast you can move in a straight line, but also your maneuverability. So if you had a ship that was really, really maneuverable, like a Jianchip, but not necessarily really fast in a straight line, it would still be highly mobile. And the same could be true on the other side, where you'd have a Drake Herald that's basically a gigantic engine with very few maneuvering thrusters. It would be very high in maneuverability or mobility too. So with that in mind, I'm going to go through and start talking about each of the different manufacturers we have and kind of where they fall on there in a general sense. Again, this is just kind of my opinion, so let's get this. Okay, so again, we have weapon survivability, mobility. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the first group we got here, which is Aegis. So Aegis, I believe Aegis is the oldest of the military ships. They were the ones that the Messers used, and once the Messers fell out of power, Aegis kind of fell out of favor, but they're still kind of a really balanced ship line. They tend to favor firepower and maneuverability over survivability. So over armor and shields, they'll tend to lean towards maneuverability and firepower, but they're still a pretty balanced brand. That's kind of where I was just kind of looking over the main line of their ship. So you think of things like the Saber, and it tends to be pretty maneuverable, has pretty good guns. The shields are okay. They used to have 3 shields on it, which made it the meta ship for the while that it was going there, but that's since changed. So that's where I tend to think Aegis falls, is kind of a balanced ship, kind of leaning in between firepower and maneuverability, and kind of lacking in shields in sort of the balance sense. So that should kind of give you an idea of where I'm leaning on these things. It's much more of a general sense than the Saber is this, the other ship is this, the other ship is this. This is just kind of the brand in general. Where did they lean? So with that in mind, let's keep going. So that's Aegis. Anvil, I tend to think of kind of being the other direction. So where Aegis is down here, kind of leaning between firepower and maneuverability, Anvil tends to lean between firepower and survivability. So they'll tend to have not necessarily better shields, but they'll have better armor. So you have things like the Hornet, which is the way it used to play out back when there was only a handful of fighters in the game. The Hornet and the Saber kind of ran the show, and the Hornet ran it by being just a tank. It could just absorb all kinds of damage and not blow up. So its basic hit points were pretty good. So it was survivable and it had a lot of guns. Whereas Anvil was kind of maneuverable and had a lot of guns. So let's move on. So here we've got our first alien one. This is Apoha. Not surprisingly, Jianchips, they have, all of them have like highly mobile engines and everything. So they're very maneuverable. So this is another example, kind of like I was saying in the intro, where they tend to lean more heavily on maneuverability rather than straight line speed. So they'll, when the flight mechanics are fully in the game, things like the Cartual and the Santokiai, and possibly even the Gaitek Railin, should be really maneuverable for their class. They may not be the fastest ships, but they'll be able to avoid fire and just be crazily maneuverable. Their firepower is okay. I'd say that it's average to low for a ship of their size. So I moved a little bit away from firepower. Their shields are going to be okay, but they're going to rely more on maneuverability to survive than shields or armor. So I leaned it more towards mobility than either of the other two. It's not an extreme. I don't think there's not going to be too many examples of manufacturers that are like all the way down here in thrusters. That would literally just be an engine. You wouldn't even have like a cockpit to sit in, because that would give you some modicum of survivability. It wouldn't have a gun on the front, even a pistol, because that would give you some modicum of firepower. So most things are going to kind of fall in here, but this will just kind of give you an idea to which way manufacturers lean. So let's keep going back to one of the serious industrials, which is Argo. And Argo is obviously not very fast. They have real small guns for their ships. So you can sort of see that the circle is leaning a little bit more that away towards engines and shields, but heavily leaning towards like armor. So they're reliable, they're sturdy, they're not going to have very much in the way of firepower. They're not going to be very fast or maneuverable. That's Argo. What they do very well is move stuff around. So they're pure industrial. Moving on, we got another alien. We got Banu here. So Banu tends to be pretty balanced. I'd almost say I would almost move this dot a little bit more down towards survivability and mobility, just because right now we only have 2 examples of Banu ships, and that's going to happen with a few of these, where we only have 1 or 2 ships to go off of, and so not much. And right now we only have 1 ship of the Banu that's flyable. We know the Banu Merchantman is on the way eventually, one day. Hopefully next year at the end of it, if not 2024. But at least going by the Defender, the guns for the size of the ship, which it's roughly the size of a Titan, it's somewhere in that range, like a Titan Avenger, or Avenger Titan. Warlock, kind of that starter plus size. You'd expect it to have more firepower and missiles than it does, but where it makes up for that is it's actually fairly maneuverable, and it's got the Tavaran shields. So I'd lean it a little bit more towards survivability. Right now it's kind of in a weird place. It sort of seems like they kind of half-ass the balance, and they're just kind of like, let's not touch this thing until the flight models are really in. I might have biffed this one just because the Tavaran shields, they might actually lean more towards maneuverability, because the Defender is relatively agile in some ways. Firepower's okay. Yeah, so that one maybe down here, but I still lean towards that as long as it's rocking the Tavaran shields. So the longest name manufacturer is Consolidated Outlands. And again, they're more after the civilian market. They don't really have a military ship outside of probably the Mustang Delta is the closest thing they have. And even that is just sort of a gimmicky skirmisher. They're more like Tesla than like Boeing or something like that. They're not known for their military ships. But what they do have is pretty good flight characteristics from what we've seen so far. like the Nomad, the Mustangs, hover quad. They don't really rely all that much on shields. They don't rely all that much on firepower, but they do kind of have good straight line speed and good maneuverability. So they do kind of favor mobility a bit more than the other manufacturers do, just to keep themselves relevant. And moving on, we've got one that kind of follows the same line is Crusader. So Crusader doesn't really go heavy on shields. It doesn't seem their shields are kind of average for the ships of their size, but all of their ships have good acceleration. Oh, that was the piece of mobility that I forgot. Is you've got acceleration, straight line speed, and maneuverability. That's all mobility. So Crusader ships, like you've got the C2, which is the size of a Genesis, or not a Genesis. Is it a Genesis? Gemini? The Starfarer. The Starfarer. So you take the Starfarer versus the C2. They're the similar size, but the Crusader ship straight line speed will blow it out of the water. Mercury Star Runner has some of the fastest acceleration in the game. So Crusader leans into the mobility also. They do have some guns, but the reason I sort of leaned them over towards guns rather than shields is their shields are okay. So it's not so much that their firepower is overwhelming, like the Mercury Star Runner, for example, has 6 size 3s, which is nothing compared to a Constellation, for example, or Drake Corsair, especially. But they're the same sort of class of ship. But it still has better firepower than it does shields. Crusader ships, a lot like a POA, will tend to lean on their mobility for survivability more than shields or firepower. So I put them down here. Let's roll on up. Here is one that people are probably a little bit familiar with, is Drake. Drake obviously leans into firepower. So they're kind of a firepower focused. I'd almost consider putting them on the line of firepower because they're relatively balanced between maneuverability and shields. It's just they have a reputation for going really light on their armor. Their shields are average, but they have light armor, which is what they're known for, which isn't in the game yet. So we're not quite sure what that's going to do. But the devs have kind of been prepping us with that by saying they're not real survivable, but they hit really hard. So they're leaning heavily into the firepower. And they do tend to be a bit more maneuverable than ships their size. Like if you compare the Freelancer and the Cutlass, Cutlass has a lot more thrusters covering it. And so it's maneuverability. If you ever get in a fight between a Freelancer and a Cutlass, if you're the Freelancer, unless you're going full reverse trying to get away from the Cutlass, it's going to outmaneuver you. And same thing goes for the Buccaneer. Low shields, low armor, low hit points, but it's really maneuverable and it has a lot of guns. So that is where Drake kind of lands. I'd even lean this a little bit further out, but they have some examples that don't always conform to that, like the Caterpillar. But yeah, you think of the majority of their ships, the Buccaneer, the Cutlass, the Corsair, they're all over here. And they lean away from like hit points and raw survivability. So let's go on up. This is one that isn't even in the game yet. This is Gatok. This is the other Xian manufacturer. And this is one that they have a manufacturer for them. So this is for the Xian, and they're just now selling the ship to humans. And to be perfectly honest, we don't know anything about the Xian ships beyond the Cartual, which we've got in the game right now. But you can generally kind of get the themes on what they're going for with the species. It's not very heavily gunned ship, the Raelin isn't. The shields are okay. They're probably going to be pretty good, but it looks like it's going to lean more on maneuverability. I'd especially I would kind of even lean away from this a little bit, maybe put it a little bit more on the line of maneuverability, just because the Gaitek Rallin just kind of has this sort of X shape that is huge in a front profile, which is not going to do it any favors in a fight. But it's probably going to be pretty maneuverable, probably going to be pretty decent in a straight line acceleration. So until we hear more, I'll put it there. Again, one ship and it's not in game yet. We don't really know. Grey Cat. This is one that we have a few examples of. They're another industrial group, not combat ships. They're pretty much down here. They'll have decent speed. Actually, I'd almost put them out here in between survivability and speed, because some of the examples that we have of Grey Cat are actually move along at a decent clip. Definitely wouldn't go heavy on the guns though. So somewhere along this line away from the weapons. I'm trying to think of any Grey Cat vehicle that has guns on it. Hang on one second. I'm going to go check. Yeah, so Grey Cat, I was conflating them with Argo. I was trying to remember if they had any spaceships, and they don't. It's all the Rock, the PTV, the STV, the RTV, which is basically a Jeep. So yeah, actually on further thought, if I were going to do this again, I would actually lean there. Changing my mind. I'm going to lean down here. So yeah, if I were going to put Argo down, or Grey Cat, that's where I put Grey Cat. They're relatively survivable, decent at speed, no weapons, unless they bring back the days that we can use mining lasers as weapons. We do have the Cygnus mining drone, but even that doesn't have guns, last we heard. So that's Grey Cat, very specialized, very industrial, not combat focused. So let's go on. We've got Kruger, which is, we've only got 2 examples of spacecraft for Kruger. I think they were primarily like in lore, sort of component or engine manufacturer, if I remember right. But they've got the Archimedes and the Merlin, the snubs that fit on the constellation Aquila and Phoenix and Andromeda. That's the Merlin and the Archimedes. They've got decent firepower for such tiny ships. They don't have quantum drives. Not a lot of hit points, obviously. They're snubs, but they're pretty quick. You can use them in racing, and they're decent. They're fast straight line speed, not great maneuverability, but they're so small that the thrusters have a lot of effect on them. Can't take a hit, so they're on this line, and they're leaning heavily towards thrusters. We've only got 2 examples of Kruger ships. Hopefully we get more one day, because they've got kind of an interesting sort of, almost like a 1950s style to them, which is kind of neat. But let's move on. This is one that we have a few more examples of. This is Misc. And Misc is kind of a nice, balanced ship line. I'd almost say they lean a little bit more towards survivability. But their engines aren't bad, so they're kind of balanced there. Their firepower, at least when compared to other ships in the same lineup, tends to be a little underwhelming. They have like bigger guns, but they tend to be fixed, and their turrets face backwards, so they're more based on getting away than duking it out. Although they do have some examples like the Starfarer Gemini and the Freelancer Misc that kind of buck the trend and go over here. So I kind of put them damn near the middle of the triangle, but they, in general, they tend to sort of favor more shields and thrusters, or shields and straight line speed over overwhelming firepower. Not much else to say about Misc. They're kind of an industrial manufacturer, so you're going to kind of see the people that are more combat focused are obviously going to lean more towards weapons, while the industrial ones will lean more towards survivability. And the sort of touring luxury brands will lean more towards mobility. So let's go on. Speaking of luxury brands, we got Origin, which, unsurprising, is kind of like Misc, but they're down here more on the maneuverability line or the mobility line. Again, tend to be pretty fast ships. If you've ever tried to race a 600i in a straight line, they're pretty quick. And the same is true for all their ships. Straight line speed, very good. They're made to get away from fights, not fight it out. And so their guns, while not awful, they're not super impressive. Their shields, they tend to have decent shields, but they're not amazing. Their focus is more getting away than taking the hits or dealing out the hits. That's what Origin is about. Again, civilian luxury touring, gonna lean towards mobility. And then RSI is one of the more balanced manufacturers in the game. Not surprising, since they have the president's or the chairman's name on there, but they tend to lean more towards firepower than the other two. I'd almost say they lean towards firepower and survivability. They're not super maneuverable, but they tend to pack a pretty heavy punch, at least from what we've seen. Although you look at things like the Mantis and, well, the Mantis goes and it has the interdiction. So again, I consider that a weapon, even though it's not blowing up your ship. It's preventing your ship from doing something it would otherwise be able to do, which is quantum away from trouble. So yeah, I'm fine with that. They're a little bit heavier on the weapons than they are on the shields and the maneuverability. You look at something like a Scorpius, makes sense. So yeah, I'll stick by that. That makes sense. Past me, good job. Now we got one that we've really only seen ground vehicles from, and that is Tumble. Obviously, the Nova Tonk is one of these. The Cyclones, they tend to be pretty quick outside of the Tonk. Even the Tonk isn't slow. I'm not sure if it's faster than an Ursa or not. So the Tonk would probably lean more, probably be more up here, but there's going to be exceptions to the rules. Generally, you got things like the Cyclones, which is the bulk of Tumble's lineup. Tends to be a little bit more mobile. Firepower is decent. They don't really have shields. Again, outside the Tonk is going to have shields and armor. So the Tonk is kind of the weirdo that's sitting like here, but they tend towards mobility, then firepower, then survivability. And then finally, we have one ship, which I think is it the Glaive? This is Vanduel. And we've got exactly one Vanduel ship that isn't made by Asperia. And you'll note that I didn't put Asperia on here because they're basically a historical manufacturer. They'll go back and they'll make ships from other alien races from the past. And so they don't have a distinct style of their own. They're creating another race's style. So they're recreating another race's style. So we only have a couple one example in game of a Vanduel ship, but just from what we've seen in Squadron 42, what we know about them, they generally hit very, very hard and they're pretty fast, so they're raiders. So they're probably kind of similar to Drake in a sense. They're not really too concerned about taking a hit unless you're talking about the spikes on their ship, which very much are. They want to ram you with those spikes, but the actual body of the ship probably isn't that tough. But yeah, I'd say the Vanduel probably fall down here, not entirely on this line because they do have some shields and some armor, assumedly. But yeah, I'd lean them heavily towards attacking and having the speed to catch you to attack you. And that's kind of what I got for this one, guys. This is meant to be kind of a short, fun one. Let me know what you think down below. If I whiffed on one of these or if you agree, let me know down in the comments. I hope everyone's enjoying IAE. I hope you didn't spend too much money or money you didn't have. For the fellow Yanks out there, happy Turkey Day. For everyone else, happy Thursday and Friday and weekend. That's about all I got, gang. See you next time.